My parents always called me the dumb one while my sister got a full ride to Harvard. On the night of her graduation dinner, my father stood up in front of 50 wealthy guests to humiliate me, announcing she would inherit a $20 million mansion and a brand new Tesla because I was too stupid to handle adult money. I sat silently in the back corner taking his abuse. But what my arrogant family did not know was that the strange man walking through the restaurant doors was carrying a sealed envelope that would financially ruin every single person at that main table. My name is Naomi. I am 33 years old, and for over a decade I was the black sheep, the college dropout, the stain on my family's immaculate country club reputation. But while they were busy polishing their fake crowns, I was building an empire in the shadows. If you are watching this right now, drop a comment letting me know where you are from. And if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace and your sanity, hit that like and subscribe button. You are going to love how this ends. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the hum of pretentious laughter echoed off the gold-leafed ceilings of Le Chandelier. It was one of Manhattan's most exclusive Michelin-star restaurants. I sat in a dimly lit corner squeezed between a large potted fern and my deaf great-aunt Mildred. This was the designated kids' table of the family. It was a quarantine zone for anyone who did not contribute directly to my parents' social climbing agenda. Tonight was the ultimate coronation for Caroline, my 28-year-old sister. She had just walked across the stage to receive her law degree from Harvard. It was an achievement my parents wore like a shiny new Rolex, parading it around for everyone to see. Caroline sat at the center of the main table. She was practically glowing in a tailored Chanel dress that cost more than my first car. To her right sat my mother, Catherine. Her face was frozen in a Botox-assisted smile of absolute triumph. To her left was Devin, Caroline's fiancé. Devin was a 32-year-old African-American hedge fund manager who carried himself with the quiet, intimidating arrogance of a man who moved millions before breakfast. My parents usually turned their noses up at anyone outside their insular old money circles. Yet they treated Devin like absolute royalty. He represented power diversity points for their carefully curated social image, and most importantly, bottomless wealth. Or so they desperately thought. I watched them from my isolated corner sipping sparkling water. The waiters glided through the room carrying trays of caviar and Wagyu beef. My parents had rented out the entire private dining room. The guest list was a who is who of New York real estate and finance. These were people my father Richard wanted to impress. He ran a luxury real estate development firm and carried himself like the king of a very loud country. I was only invited because it would look bad if the bride's sister was entirely absent. But I was explicitly told to stay out of the way. I was the family secret they preferred to keep hidden. At 20, I had dropped out of college. They told everyone I lacked the intellect to handle basic academics. They called me lazy and unstable. I never corrected them. I just packed my bags when they kicked me out and never asked them for a dime again. A sharp voice cut through my quiet observation. Naomi. I looked up to see my mother Catherine standing over my small table. Her perfectly manicured hands rested sharply on her hips. Her eyes swept over my simple black dress with poorly concealed disgust. "When the waiter comes around, make sure you hand him your own card for your drinks," she said. Her voice dropped to a harsh whisper so Devin would not hear. "We have spent $500,000 securing Caroline's future today. We simply cannot be expected to subsidize a 33-year-old woman who still plays around with useless software gigs. It is embarrassing enough that you are even here." I did not flinch. I just looked at her calmly. "Noted, mother. I will cover my own tap water." She sneered, smoothing her pearl necklace. "See that you do. And try not to draw attention to yourself. Devin's partners are at the next table. They do not need to know the bride's sister could not even finish her sophomore year of college." With that, she turned on her heel and glided back to the main table just in time for the gift presentation. I watched as Devin stood up. He adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke Tom Ford suit and smiled at the room. He pulled a sleek black velvet box from his pocket and popped it open. Inside sat a diamond tennis necklace that caught the chandelier's light and scattered it across the dining room walls. Caroline gasped dramatically. She pressed her hands to her mouth in a flawless display of rehearsed shock. "To my brilliant future wife," Devon said. His deep voice carried easily across the private dining room. "A beautiful mind deserves beautiful things." My father Richard clapped louder than anyone else from the head of the table. "A perfect merger of two great empires," he boomed, raising his crystal glass high into the air. To Devon and Caroline, I watched them toast. The bile was rising in my throat. If they only knew the truth about their glorious empires, they would be choking on that expensive champagne. I pushed an $80 piece of asparagus around my plate. My phone buzzed quietly in my lap. I glanced down at the screen. A message was waiting for me. It simply read that the target was acquired and he was 5 minutes away. I typed back a single thumbs-up emoji and locked the screen. The trap was set. All I had to do was let them keep talking. The dinner dragged on into an agonizing parade of self-congratulation and financial posturing. Everyone at the main table was practically tripping over themselves to praise Devon and his diamond necklace. My mother Catherine leaned across Caroline to pat Devon on the arm. She was fawning over him with a level of adoration she had never once directed at her own flesh and blood. "You simply spoil her, Devon," she cooed loudly enough for the neighboring tables to hear. But then again, a man in your position understands the value of a high-yield investment. Caroline is going to make the perfect wife for a hedge fund manager. Devon flashed a perfectly white smile and adjusted his posture. "It is easy to invest in perfection, Catherine. My fund had a record-breaking quarter last month. Moving capital around is just a numbers game, but finding a woman with a Harvard law degree and a pedigree like yours is the real prize. It is all about legacy." My father Richard nodded sagely, taking a slow sip of his expensive bourbon. "That is exactly what I have always said, Devon. Legacy is everything. When my real estate firm closed that commercial plaza deal in Manhattan last year, I told my board of directors that we are not just building skyscrapers, we are building generational wealth. Our two families coming together is a consolidation of absolute power. We are going to be completely unstoppable." I sat in my dark corner taking small bites of my food and listening to them trade fake war stories. The arrogance radiating from that table was suffocating. If anyone else had been sitting in my chair, they might have felt intimidated by all this loud talk of record-breaking quarters and generational wealth. But I was not intimidated at all. I was highly amused, because I knew the actual math behind their lies. I knew that Devon had lost 70% of his investors' money on catastrophic crypto bets the previous winter. I knew his supposedly elite hedge fund was currently drowning in margin calls and desperate debt. And I knew that my father had not closed a commercial plaza deal in Manhattan or anywhere else in over 5 years. His luxury real estate company was essentially a hollow shell teetering on the very edge of complete insolvency. They were two sinking ships, desperately tying themselves together, completely unaware that the other was made of solid lead. As the expensive dessert plates were cleared away by the waitstaff, my father decided it was time for the main event. He stood up from his leather chair and began tapping a heavy silver spoon against his crystal champagne flute. The sharp ringing sound cut through the ambient noise of the private dining room. Gradually, all conversation ceased. The wealthy guests turned their attention toward the head of the table. Richard smoothed the lapels of his tailored tuxedo and puffed out his chest. He was a man who lived for an audience, and tonight he had a captive one. "Family, friends, and distinguished guests," Richard began, his voice booming with practiced authority. "Today we celebrate absolute excellence. When Catherine and I raised our daughters, we set the bar incredibly high. We demanded greatness. We did not accept excuses. And Caroline did not just reach that bar, she soared entirely over it." Caroline beamed, resting her head delicately on Devon's shoulder. She looked around the room, soaking in the admiring gazes of the elite attendees. "Success in this family is not handed out on a silver platter." Richard continued, his tone shifting from celebratory to hard and lecturing. "It must be earned. It requires intellect, grit, and a pedigree of relentless hard work. It requires a mind sharp enough to navigate the brutal reality of the modern business world. Success is not for the weak, and it is certainly not for those who quit when things get a little hard. The temperature in the room seemed to drop significantly. His eyes darted directly to my isolated table in the corner. The silence became heavy and awkward. Several guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats following his gaze. He could not just praise his golden child. He had to use me as a stepping stone to elevate her. He needed a villain to make his hero look better. Because Caroline has proven she has what it takes to carry the family legacy, Richard declared, turning his attention back to the center of the room. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a heavy set of keys. He tossed them onto the table right in front of Caroline with a dramatic clatter. "Your mother and I are officially gifting you the title to the Hamptons estate, all $20 million of it. Oh, and the new Tesla parked out front with the red ribbon on it. That is yours too." The room erupted into rapturous applause. Caroline shrieked, covering her face with her hands before throwing her arms around my mother and father. Devin stood up to kiss her cheek, looking incredibly pleased with the massive infusion of assets he thought he was marrying into. Richard held up a hand, silencing the room once more. He was not finished. He turned his body completely toward my corner, a cruel, mocking smile playing on his lips. His voice grew loud enough that every single person in the restaurant could hear him clearly. "I am officially rewriting the family trust tomorrow morning," he announced. "Caroline will be the sole heir from this day forward. An estate like ours needs a brilliant mind to maintain it, not someone who could not even hold down a basic college workload. Naomi, I am sure you understand. You can keep playing with your little computer codes and doing your freelance gigs, but adult money belongs with the adults." The humiliation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The wealthy guests stared at me. Their faces showed a mix of intense pity and awkward discomfort. Devin looked over at me and shook his head slightly, offering a gesture of absolute condescension. My mother looked smug, her chin raised in victory. I did not cry. I did not yell. I did not storm out of the restaurant. I simply set my fork down and looked at my watch. It was exactly 8:30. Right on cue, the heavy doors swung open. Wesley walked in. He was dressed in a navy suit and carried a black leather briefcase. He moved across the floor with the precision of an executioner. The room fell silent. Every guest stopped breathing as Wesley bypassed the main table and walked toward my dark corner. He ignored my father and Devin. He stopped beside my table and snapped the latches of his briefcase open. He reached inside and pulled out an envelope sealed with red wax. He placed it gently onto the tablecloth next to my sparkling water. "It is done," Naomi, Wesley said. His voice carried perfectly through the dead, silent room. "The wire has cleared, the ink is dry. It is time to show them who you really are." I picked up the envelope, feeling the true weight of the paper. Every eye in the restaurant was glued to me. The triumphant smile of my father had completely collapsed. It was replaced by a confused scowl. He did not like losing the attention of his audience, and certainly did not like unauthorized interruptions during his grand performances. "Excuse me," Richard barked, stepping away from the head of the table and marching toward us. "Who the hell are you? This is a highly exclusive private event. Security should have never let you through those doors. I am the Chief of Staff and Primary Legal Counsel." Wesley replied without missing a single beat. He did not cower. He did not look directly at my father, treating him with the exact same dismissive indifference that Richard had shown me for a decade. Catherine scoffed very loudly, trying to break the thick, heavy tension filling the room. She let out a mocking laugh. "Naomi, what is this ridiculous stunt? Did you spend your meager savings to hire some cheap actor to come in here and make yourself look important? You are embarrassing us in front of the elite partners. You have always been prone to these dramatic, childish outbursts when you do not get your way." I ignored her shrill voice. I kept my eyes focused solely on the envelope in my hands. I slid my thumb under the flap and cracked the thick red wax seal. I pulled out the crisp financial document folded neatly inside. I unfolded the paper and stared at the bold black numbers printed across the center line. $50 million. It was the buyout check from a Wall Street acquisition of my anonymous financial technology platform, a platform I had built from absolutely nothing. But to fully understand why this specific moment felt so intensely intoxicating, you have to understand the nightmare I had meticulously unraveled. You have to understand the terrifying reality I had uncovered exactly 6 months ago. My family thought I was a failure because they had deliberately engineered my failure. They thought I was drowning because they were the ones holding my head underwater. 6 months prior to this dinner, I was living in a modest apartment in Brooklyn. I was quietly running my software startup far away from my parents. My team had developed an advanced artificial intelligence-driven risk assessment algorithm. It was highly innovative and was just starting to catch the attention of several major financial institutions. I kept my head down, lived frugally, and poured every cent of revenue right back into the business infrastructure. I worked 18-hour days surviving on cheap coffee and pure relentless ambition. One Tuesday morning, I decided to apply for a basic commercial line of credit to expand my server capacity. My business was growing rapidly, and we needed more computational power to handle incoming client data. I filled out the banking applications and submitted my personal information, expecting a routine approval within a few days. Instead, I was rejected, automatically and instantly. I was confused. I lived a debt-free life. I paid my modest rent on time every month. I did not own a car and paid off my credit card balances in full every cycle. There was absolutely no logical reason for a financial institution to instantly deny a small business credit line to someone with a flawless financial history. Seeking answers. I logged into a portal and pulled my credit report. I expected to find a simple clerical error. What I saw made my blood run cold. My heart pounded as I scrolled through pages of absolute financial devastation. My credit score was not just bad, it was obliterated. It was a radioactive wasteland. There were dozens of defaulted personal loans. There were several maxed-out luxury credit cards. There were massive missed mortgage payments on properties in zip codes I had never visited. There were millions of dollars in outstanding toxic debt and aggressive collection notices, all legally tied to my Social Security number. Someone had stolen my identity and destroyed my financial future, and they had been doing it for over 10 years. Most people would have panicked. They would have called the police and filed fraud reports. But I did not panic. I work with complex data. I build algorithms that trace hidden patterns and uncover financial anomalies. I knew exactly how to track digital footprints. I hired a forensic accountant who specialized in corporate fraud. I handed him the data and told him to follow the money. Within a week, the truth was laid bare on my kitchen table. The forensic accountant handed me a thick binder containing undeniable paper trails, bank transfer receipts, and forged signatures. The identity thieves were not nameless, faceless hackers operating out of a foreign country. The thieves were my own parents, Richard and Catherine. They had stolen my identity when I was 22 years old, right after they kicked me out of their house for dropping out of college. They used my clean Social Security number to secure massive high-interest loans. They funneled millions into their accounts, leaving me holding the bag for catastrophic debt. My own flesh and blood had turned me into their sacrificial lamb. Why did they target me instead of a stranger? Because I was the disposable daughter. When I dropped out of college, they realized I was no longer useful to their social climbing agenda. They assumed I would fade into obscurity, never checking my credit score. They used the money they stole in my name to fund Caroline. They bought their luxury lifestyle with my stolen future. They deliberately destroyed my life so they could play pretend. That was why they mocked me for renting an apartment instead of owning property. They knew I could not get a loan. They had chained me to the bottom of the ocean and then stood on the dock laughing at me for drowning. But I was not drowning. I had built a massive company using a limited liability corporation that shielded my personal identity. When I discovered the fraud, I did not call them crying. Confrontation gives the enemy time to prepare and hide their tracks. Instead, I instructed my forensic accountant to dig deeper. If Richard was stealing my identity, to float his lifestyle, just how completely broke was he? The accountant tore into my father and his business records. The findings were absolutely pathetic. Richard and his luxury real estate company had been bleeding cash for a decade. He was essentially running a desperate shell game, borrowing money from new investors to pay off the old ones. He was mere weeks away from total bankruptcy. The $20 million Hamptons mansion he just proudly gifted to Caroline had 3 separate liens against it. It was completely toxic. The bank was preparing to foreclose on the property, and Richard knew it. He was putting on a theatrical show to hide his imminent ruin. But the biggest shock of the investigation was not my father. It was Devin. I instructed my team to look into the brilliant billionaire hedge fund manager my sister was marrying. Devin carried himself like a king of Wall Street. He demanded absolute respect. He constantly reminded everyone that as an African American man, he had to work 10 times harder to secure his position among the financial elite. He used his background as a shield against any scrutiny. But Devin was a complete fraud. His prestigious hedge fund had made 3 catastrophic bets on emerging cryptocurrency markets the previous winter. His entire portfolio had been wiped out. He was faking his lavish lifestyle while secretly drowning in massive margin calls and desperate debt. The hilarious truth hit me like a freight train. Devin was marrying Caroline because he thought Richard was a wealthy billionaire who could bail out his failing fund. Richard was eagerly handing Caroline over to Devin because he thought Devin was a Wall Street titan who could save his real estate company. They were 2 sinking ships frantically trying to tie themselves together. Neither man realized the other was made of solid lead. They were both running a desperate long con, and my sister was the oblivious pawn caught right in the middle. Knowing all of this, I could have easily confronted them. I could have exposed the fraud, filed police reports, and sent my parents to prison for identity theft. But simply sending them to jail would not be enough. They had stolen 10 years of my life and branded me a useless failure. They had isolated me from our extended relatives and laughed at my supposed misery. I wanted them to feel the exact same helpless desperation they had forced upon me. I wanted them to lose everything they valued most. Their social status, their fake wealth, and their pristine reputation had to be destroyed in public. So I decided to stay completely quiet and still. I watched from the shadows as they planned their extravagant wedding and celebrated their fake achievements. While they were busy choosing expensive floral arrangements and booking Michelin star restaurants, I meticulously built a huge financial trap they would never see coming. About 3 months before the graduation dinner, my plan hit a dangerous snag. Devin and Richard were desperately hunting for fresh capital to keep their respective scams afloat. During their frantic search for money, they stumbled upon a mid-sized financial technology startup that was generating massive revenue. They started digging into the corporate structure of this anonymous company, hoping to steal its proprietary algorithm or force a cheap buyout. They had no idea that the company they were targeting belonged to me. When they finally unmasked the chief executive officer, they were shocked to find my name on the corporate documents. But instead of feeling proud of me, their greed took over completely. They realized my platform was worth tens of millions of dollars. They decided they needed to take it from me. But they knew I would never simply hand over my life work. They needed a legal loophole to seize control of my assets without my consent. They hatched a plan so vile it made my stomach turn. Richard, Catherine, and Caroline decided to stage a fake mental health intervention. They wanted to use my past struggles against me. They planned to claim that dropping out of college had triggered a long-term psychological breakdown. They intended to argue that I was highly unstable and entirely incapable of managing my own business affairs. Their ultimate goal was to force me into a legal conservatorship. If they could get a judge to declare me incompetent, Richard would be appointed as my legal guardian. He would gain total control over my company, sell the algorithm to the highest bidder, and use my money to save himself and Devin. They actually hired a corrupt psychiatrist who was a member of their country club to evaluate me under false pretenses. The doctor was paid a massive cash bribe to write a highly damaging medical report stating I was a severe danger to myself and others. This fake clinical diagnosis would give them the ultimate power to ruin me. They invited me to what they called a family healing dinner at my parents' house. I knew it was a carefully orchestrated ambush, but I went anyway. I needed to play the role of the vulnerable and unstable daughter perfectly to buy myself enough time. After the main course was cleared away, Devon cornered me alone in my father's private study. He closed the heavy oak doors, firmly locking us inside, and leaned against them, trapping me in the room. He dropped his usual charming facade immediately. He looked at me with cold and ruthless calculation. He adjusted his expensive luxury watch and delivered his aggressive ultimatum. Black men have to work 10 times harder to achieve this level of elite status, Naomi, he said. His voice was dripping with condescending authority and false sympathy. I have built an incredible empire, and I will not let your mental stubbornness tank my fund or destroy this family. We know all about your technology company. We know you are struggling psychologically. If you try to fight us in court, you will lose everything. Sign the company over to my management right now. I will protect your assets and I will personally vouch for your recovery before your parents. Do not make this harder than it has to be. I looked at him and let my hands tremble visibly. I forced thick tears into my eyes, playing the exact pathetic part they had written for me. I told him I was completely overwhelmed and deeply exhausted by the pressure. I begged for just a little more time to process everything before signing the corporate transfer papers. Devon smiled a predatory grin and patted my shoulder condescendingly. He told me I had exactly 2 weeks to heal and get my mind right before the paperwork became mandatory. He truly thought he had won. He thought he had broken me into submission. I walked out of that house wiping away my fake tears and immediately got to work. I did not need 2 weeks. I only needed 10 days. I met with Wesley at a secure corporate office building in downtown Manhattan. We had been quietly negotiating the sale of my financial technology platform to a massive Wall Street investment bank. They had run my code through their aggressive stress tests and realized my algorithm was a revolutionary breakthrough in market analysis. We sat across a long glass conference table from 3 seasoned acquisition executives. They offered $40 million for total ownership of the platform. I slid the contract back across the table and looked them directly in the eye. I told them my technology would save their risk assessment department $200 million in the first year alone. I demanded $50 million in a clean cash buyout. I also required the transaction to be completely sealed and untraceable until the funds cleared my private accounts. The executives hesitated for only a moment before shaking my hand enthusiastically. The deal was officially struck. While my family was busy picking out expensive floral arrangements for Caroline's graduation dinner and preparing fake legal documents for my conservatorship, I was legally securing $50 million in liquid capital. But having the money was only the first step of my master plan. I did not just want to walk away rich and successful. I wanted absolute destruction for the people who tried to ruin me. I directed Wesley to utilize a highly discreet holding company to begin purchasing toxic debt. We started with my father. Richard owed millions to a consortium of private lenders who were desperate to offload his failing real estate notes. Because his company was on the verge of total collapse, these lenders were willing to sell his debt for pennies on the dollar. Within 48 hours, my holding company successfully purchased every single major loan tied to his real estate firm. I legally became his primary creditor. I held the mortgage on the $20 million Hamptons mansion he was currently bragging about. I held the liens on his luxury cars and his corporate bank accounts. If he missed a single payment, I had the absolute legal authority to seize everything he owned. And I knew he was going to miss his next payment because his bank accounts were completely empty. Next, I turned my full attention to Devon and his fraudulent hedge fund. Devon had borrowed heavily from a secondary-tier investment firm to cover his massive cryptocurrency losses. He had leveraged his future earnings and his personal assets to keep his fund afloat while pretending to be a billionaire. Wesley contacted the investment firm and made them a cash offer they simply could not refuse. We bought Devon's debt outright. I now owned the very financial chains that were dragging him underwater. The chessboard was finally set, and I controlled every single piece. I held the absolute power to destroy both of their fake empires with a single phone call. I orchestrated the foreclosure documents and asset seizures to trigger simultaneously. I timed the legal execution perfectly. Everything would collapse precisely on the evening of Caroline's graduation dinner. I wanted them surrounded by their wealthy friends and elite partners when the floor dropped out from under them. I wanted them to feel the exact same public humiliation they had subjected me to for years. The stage was prepared for the greatest performance of my life. I wanted to watch their smug faces fall as they realized the daughter they called a dumb college dropout was the one holding the deed to their entire lives. I briefed Wesley on the exact minute he needed to walk into the restaurant. Every detail was meticulously planned to ensure maximum impact and zero chance of escape. I was ready to burn their kingdom to the ground. I would take everything they loved and leave them with nothing but the bitter truth of their own horrific choices. The time for waiting was finally over. The time for waiting was finally over. But arriving at that moment of absolute power required meticulous preparation. It required pulling back the heavy velvet curtain on my father's supposed empire to expose the rot underneath. To understand exactly how I trapped him, you have to see what my private investigator uncovered during those silent months of planning. I knew my parents had stolen my identity to secure fraudulent loans, but I needed to know why. I needed to understand the mechanics of their desperation. I hired a man named Donovan. He was a ruthless corporate private investigator who specialized in dismantling the financial illusions of the New York elite. Donovan was not a man who operated in the spotlight. He worked in the digital shadows, tracking wire transfers, offshore accounts, and hidden corporate liabilities. I met him in a sterile, windowless conference room in Lower Manhattan. I handed him the file containing my ruined credit report and my parents' personal information. I paid his exorbitant retainer in cash and gave him a single directive. I told him to tear their financial lives apart and bring me every dirty secret he could find. Donovan went to work with terrifying efficiency. He bypassed the public relations fluff and dug straight into the corporate filings of my father's luxury real estate development firm. For weeks, I funded Donovan's deep dive using the steady revenue stream from my financial technology platform. Every Friday evening, we met in that same windowless room to review the growing mountain of evidence. What Donovan found was not just a failing business, it was a spectacular slow-motion train wreck. My father loved to boast about his dominance in the commercial real estate market. He carried himself like a titan of industry. But Donovan slid a stack of audited financial statements across the table that painted a shockingly different picture. 10 years ago, Richard had attempted to develop a massive commercial plaza in a highly competitive district. His ego drove him to overpay for the land. Almost immediately, the project hit severe zoning issues and catastrophic construction delays. To cover his massive daily losses, Richard started taking out high-interest mezzanine loans from aggressive private lenders. When those initial loans came due, he lacked the capital to pay them back, so he took out new loans just to pay the interest on the old loans. He had essentially built a corporate Ponzi scheme using institutional money and predatory private lenders. Donovan showed me the internal ledger. Richard had not closed a single successful real estate deal in over 5 years. His company was a hollow shell entirely devoid of actual revenue. He was bleeding cash at an alarming rate, simply trying to keep up appearances and maintain his membership at the elite country clubs. Then we looked at his personal assets. I asked Donovan to investigate the crown jewel of my father's portfolio, the $20 million Hamptons estate that he so proudly flaunted, the very same estate he intended to loudly gift to Caroline at her graduation dinner. Donovan let out a dark laugh when I brought it up. He opened a new folder and laid out 3 separate bank liens on the conference table. Richard did not own that mansion, the banks did. He had leveraged that property 3 separate times over the last decade. He had taken out a massive primary mortgage followed by a massive secondary equity line of credit. When traditional banks finally cut him off, he turned to the shadow banking sector. He took out a tertiary loan from a ruthless private equity group using the heavily leveraged house as collateral. The mansion was entirely underwater. The equity was non-existent. If any of those three lenders decided to call the note, Richard would be instantly evicted and left completely homeless. This devastating financial reality explained exactly why they needed my social security number. Richard had completely exhausted all of his legitimate credit avenues. His name and his company were flagged as high risk across every major financial institution in the country. He desperately needed fresh, clean credit to keep the lights on. He needed untraceable funds to maintain his luxurious facade and pay for Caroline's astronomically expensive Harvard tuition. He looked at me, his own daughter, and saw nothing but a blank check. He deliberately sacrificed my financial future to buy himself a few more years of pretending to be a billionaire. The level of his desperation was staggering. Donovan showed me intercepted emails and internal memos obtained from Richard's disgruntled former partners. In these messages, my father was actively panicking. He was quietly selling off heavy construction equipment at rock-bottom prices. He was liquidating his retirement accounts and begging old country club friends for temporary cash injections. He was dodging calls from aggressive debt collectors while simultaneously ordering custom-tailored tuxedos for his social events. He was a terrified, desperate man backed into a dark corner wearing expensive clothes to hide his overwhelming poverty. Every piece of paper Donovan handed me fueled my determination. I read through the desperate emails and the aggressive foreclosure warnings. I saw the exact dates when my parents decided to ruin my credit score just to make their minimum payments. They felt no remorse for destroying my life. They only cared about protecting Caroline and securing her marriage to Devin. They viewed Devin as their ultimate financial savior. They genuinely believed his hedge fund wealth would wipe away their massive debts and save the family empire. Donovan packed up his files at the end of our final meeting. He looked at me across the table and asked what I intended to do with this nuclear arsenal of information. I told him I was going to use it to buy every single chain that bound my father. The private investigator had given me the exact blueprint of my parents' destruction. I knew their vulnerabilities. I knew their creditors. I knew the exact amount of money it would take to become their absolute master. Armed with Donovan's research, I walked out of that conference room ready to execute the hostile takeover of my own family. Armed with Donovan's research, I walked out of that conference room ready to execute the hostile takeover of my own family. But my father was only half of the equation. The other half was the man my parents treated like a walking ATM machine. Devin. He carried himself with the intimidating arrogance of a man who moved markets with a single phone call. He wore bespoke suits, drove exotic sports cars, and frequently reminded everyone that as a black man in high finance, he had to work 10 times harder to achieve his elite status. He used his background as an impenetrable shield against any criticism or scrutiny. My parents were completely mesmerized by his performance. They practically bowed when he entered a room. I needed to know exactly how deep Devin's pockets truly were. I called Donovan back into the conference room the next week and handed him a new target file. I told the private investigator to strip away the bespoke suits and public relations articles. I wanted to see the internal ledger of Devin's supposedly untouchable hedge fund. Donovan warned me that offshore hedge funds were notoriously difficult to crack, protected by layers of shell companies and strict non-disclosure agreements. I did not care. I doubled his cash retainer and told him to find the cracks. 2 weeks later, Donovan called me on a secure line. He sounded almost giddy. He told me to come to the office immediately because what he had found was too hilarious to discuss over the phone. When I arrived, he had a single printed spreadsheet resting on the glass table. Devin was not a billionaire. He was not even a millionaire. Devin was a complete and utter fraud. Donovan explained the spectacular collapse of Devin's financial empire. 2 years ago, Devin managed a successful boutique fund. His investors were wealthy individuals looking for aggressive growth. But Devin became greedy. He developed a massive ego and decided he could outsmart the global markets. The previous winter, he took his investors' capital and made 3 highly leveraged, catastrophic bets on emerging cryptocurrency markets. He bypassed traditional risk management protocols and went all in on highly volatile digital assets. When the crypto market crashed, it wiped him out. Donovan showed me the margin calls. Devon's hedge fund lost 70% of its total value in a matter of weeks. The investors were panicking and demanding their money back, but the money was gone. To hide the massive losses and prevent a run on his fund, Devon started borrowing heavily from secondary-tier investment firms. He took out predatory loans at high interest rates just to cover quarterly distributions to his angriest investors. He was desperately plugging holes in a sinking ship while pretending he was cruising on a luxury yacht. His lavish lifestyle was entirely funded by debt. The exotic cars were leased, the expensive watches were bought on credit. Even the massive diamond tennis necklace he eventually gifted my sister was financed through a high-risk shadow lender. Devon was personally insolvent. He faced total professional ruin and potential criminal charges if his investors discovered his gross negligence. He desperately needed a massive infusion of clean liquid capital to pay off his aggressive secondary lenders and save his reputation. Then the brilliant realization hit me. I sat back in my chair and started laughing. It was a calculating laugh that echoed off the walls of the windowless room. The absolute absurdity of the situation was staggering. Devon was marrying Caroline because he genuinely believed Richard was a wealthy real estate tycoon. Devon thought he could leverage his marriage to Caroline into a massive cash bailout from his new father-in-law. He thought Richard was sitting on mountains of liquid capital that could easily cover a few bad crypto bets. At the exact same time, Richard was eagerly handing Caroline over to Devon because he genuinely believed Devon was a Wall Street titan. Richard thought he could use Devon's immense hedge fund wealth to pay off his toxic real estate loans and stop the banks from foreclosing on his properties. It was a mutual scam of epic proportions. They were two desperate con artists trying to pickpocket each other. They were both running a frantic long con, and my sister Caroline was the oblivious pawn caught right in the middle. Caroline thought she was marrying into elite financial royalty. She spent her days bragging about her future life as the wife of a billionaire hedge fund manager. She had no idea she was legally attaching herself to a man who was drowning in high-interest debt and facing federal indictments. The irony was beautiful. My parents destroyed my credit score and disowned me because they thought I was a financial liability. They threw me out into the street to protect their precious reputation. Yet they were actively pushing their golden child into a marriage that would financially ruin her. They were so blinded by their own greed and desperate need to maintain appearances that they never bothered to run a simple background check on the man joining their family. They saw Devon's expensive suits and his confident swagger, and they swallowed his lies completely. They were exactly alike. Devon and Richard were cut from the identical cloth of narcissism and delusion. I looked at Donovan and asked for the contact information of the investment firm that held Devon's massive debt. The private investigator handed me a business card with a grim smile. He knew exactly what I was planning. I did not just want to expose Devon. Exposing him would only cause a brief scandal. I wanted to own him. I wanted to become the primary debt holder of his entire life. If I controlled his debt, I controlled his future. I could trigger his margin calls and force his hedge fund into immediate liquidation with a single signature. The time to end their pathetic charade had finally arrived. The hunt began. I attended the engagement party my parents threw for Caroline and Devon just to observe them in their natural habitat. It was held at a ridiculous country club. Richard and Devon stood by the mahogany bar smoking Cuban cigars they bought on credit. They were aggressively complimenting each other. Richard bragged about a fictitious commercial zoning permit, while Devon countered with a fabricated story about a hostile takeover he engineered in Tokyo. I stood near a marble pillar sipping sparkling water and taking mental notes. They were so busy trying to swindle each other that they never noticed me watching them. Catherine was dragging Caroline around the room, showing off the massive engagement ring that Devon had financed through a predatory shadow lender. They were planning a destination wedding in Lake Como. They talked about chartering private jets and renting out historic Italian villas. They were spending imaginary money while their actual bank accounts bled out. I watched my mother look down her nose at the catering staff, completely oblivious to the fact that she was closer to their tax bracket than she was to Devon. The next day, I met Wesley at a quiet coffee shop in Brooklyn. We mapped out the entire financial battlefield. We needed to move slowly and invisibly. If Richard or Devon sensed a trap, they might declare bankruptcy early and ruin my chance to personally own their debt. Wesley set up a network of anonymous shell companies. We named the primary holding firm after my favorite childhood book, just to amuse myself. Through these untraceable corporate entities, we started approaching the desperate secondary lenders who held Richard and Devon toxic notes. We offered them clean cash to buy the debt at a slight premium. They were thrilled to offload the massive risk. Over the next 2 months, we systematically bought up every single financial chain binding my father and my future brother-in-law. I legally became the invisible landlord of their entire fake reality. I owned the paper on the country club memberships. I owned the loans on the luxury cars. I owned the mortgage on the Hamptons estate. I was their absolute master, and they did not suspect a single thing. But my silent execution encountered a dangerous complication exactly 3 months before Caroline's graduation dinner. The massive financial strain was beginning to crush Richard and Devon. Their creditors were aggressively demanding immediate minimum payments. Desperation always breeds curiosity. During a frantic search for fresh capital, Devon decided to look into my freelance software gig. He thought maybe I had saved up a few $1,000s he could borrow or steal under the guise of an investment opportunity. He used his remaining industry contacts to run a quiet background check on my limited liability corporation. He expected to find a pathetic, struggling web design business. Instead, his analysts uncovered the undeniable truth about my financial technology platform. They tracked the massive revenue streams and analyzed the proprietary risk assessment algorithm my team had built. Devon brought the findings directly to Richard. I know this because Wesley had placed a legal monitor on my corporate servers to track inquiries. We watched their digital fingerprints all over my company data. When Devon and Richard realized that the daughter they mocked as a dumb dropout was actually sitting on a technology goldmine worth tens of millions of dollars, their panic immediately turned into pure toxic greed. They realized my algorithm was the magic bullet that could save them both from total ruin. They decided they needed to take it from me, but they knew I would never simply hand over my life work. I despised them, and they knew it. They needed a legal loophole to seize control of my corporate assets without requiring my consent. They could not just ask for the money, because that would expose their own bankruptcy. They needed to take it by force. They hatched a plan so vile it made my stomach turn. Richard, Catherine, and Caroline decided to stage a fake mental health intervention. They wanted to use my past struggles against me. They planned to claim that dropping out of college had triggered a long-term psychological breakdown. They intended to argue in court that I was highly unstable and entirely incapable of managing my own business affairs. Their ultimate goal was to force me into a legal conservatorship. If they could get a judge to declare me incompetent, Richard would be appointed as my legal guardian. He would gain total control over my company, sell the algorithm to the highest bidder, and use my money to save himself and Devon. They actually hired a corrupt psychiatrist who was a prominent member of their local country club to evaluate me under completely false pretenses. The corrupt doctor was paid a massive cash bribe to write a highly damaging medical report stating I was a severe danger to myself and others. This fake clinical diagnosis would give them the ultimate legal power to ruin me permanently and seize my assets without warning. They invited me to what they called a family healing dinner at my parents' house. I knew it was a carefully orchestrated ambush, but I went anyway. I needed to play the role of the vulnerable and unstable daughter perfectly to buy myself enough time to finish my trap and destroy their lives completely. After the main course was cleared away, Devon cornered me alone in my father's private study. He closed the heavy oak doors, firmly locking us inside, and leaned against them, trapping me in the room. He dropped his usual charming facade immediately. He looked at me with cold and ruthless calculation, showing his true colors. He adjusted his expensive luxury watch and prepared to deliver his aggressive ultimatum. He wanted to break my spirit entirely and take everything I proudly owned, leaving me with absolutely nothing but bitter regret and endless suffocating despair forever. To understand how Devon ended up standing in my father's study, blocking the door and demanding the keys to my kingdom, you have to rewind the clock. You have to go back exactly 3 months before Caroline's extravagant graduation dinner. You have to see the precise moment their desperate financial panic collided with my hidden empire. The ultimatum Devon delivered was the desperate climax of a meticulously plotted corporate theft that began the day they accidentally stumbled upon my real net worth. 3 months prior to the dinner, the walls were rapidly closing in on Richard and Devon. Richard's real estate development firm had just received a final notice from a ruthless private equity group. They were preparing to seize his commercial properties and file public foreclosure notices on his Hamptons estate. At the exact same time, Devon was facing a catastrophic liquidity crisis. Two of his largest remaining investors had formally requested the immediate withdrawal of their capital. Devon did not have their money. If he failed to produce the funds within 90 days, the investors would trigger a federal investigation. An audit would expose his cryptocurrency losses and fraudulent reporting. Devon was staring down the barrel of federal prison. Richard was staring down total public bankruptcy. Absolute panic creates an incredibly powerful bond between desperate, cornered con artists. They were sitting together in Richard's opulent but heavily mortgaged Manhattan office, drinking expensive scotch they could no longer afford, brainstorming any possible way to generate fast cash. They needed a soft target, someone vulnerable they could easily manipulate or bully into signing over assets. During this frantic session, Richard remembered my existence. He remembered his discarded 33-year-old daughter. He mentioned to Devon that I had been running some sort of freelance software design business for the past decade. Richard assumed I was barely scraping by designing cheap websites for local restaurants. But Richard was desperate enough to wonder if I had managed to save a couple of $100,000 in a basic corporate checking account. He thought he could leverage his position as my father to guilt-trip me into a high-interest family loan. Devon eagerly offered to personally handle the initial financial reconnaissance. He ordered his top data analyst to run a quiet corporate background check on my limited liability company. Devon expected the analyst to come back with a pathetic financial profile showing a few $1,000s in annual profit. He told his team to look for any liquid cash or unencumbered business assets that could be quickly liquidated. The young analyst spent 48 sleepless hours digging deeply through public corporate registries, vendor contracts, and digital footprint data. When the analyst finally walked into Devon's corner office to deliver the preliminary financial report, he looked completely pale. He placed a thick stack of printed data files on the mahogany desk. He explained that my company was not a small freelance web design gig. He explained that my corporate entity owned a highly sophisticated financial technology platform. The analyst showed Devon the application programming interface logs. My risk assessment algorithm was currently being licensed by 3 of the largest institutional banks in the country. The daily transaction volume passing through my servers was staggering. When Devon read the final valuation printed at the bottom of the report, his heart nearly stopped. The analyst estimated my company was worth anywhere from $40 million to $60 million on the open market. It was a completely debt-free, cash-flowing technology goldmine wholly owned by a single shareholder. Me. Devon immediately dismissed the analyst and locked his office door. He called Richard in a state of absolute breathless shock, telling his future father-in-law to come to the hedge fund office immediately. When Richard arrived, Devon laid the corporate valuation reports out on the table. He watched Richard's face transform from exhausted desperation to utter disbelief. They sat in total silence for several minutes, digesting the sheer magnitude of the discovery. The daughter Richard had publicly labeled as the dumb one, the college dropout he had mercilessly mocked and permanently disowned, was actually sitting on a mountain of liquid wealth. I was richer than Richard had ever been during his absolute prime. I was more successful than Devin could ever hope to be. A normal parent might have felt a sudden surge of overwhelming pride. A normal father might have finally realized his terrible mistakes and genuinely apologized. But Richard was a cornered narcissist drowning in debt, and Devin was an arrogant predator looking for a quick kill. Instead of feeling pride or remorse, their shock rapidly curdled into toxic entitlement. They convinced themselves I did not deserve that wealth. Richard reasoned that because he had provided my early childhood education, he was inherently entitled to the fruits of my labor. Devin rationalized that because he was a professional financial manager, he was far better equipped to handle a multi-million-dollar technology portfolio than a college dropout. They could not simply ask me for a loan. If they asked for money, they would have to admit their own spectacular failures. Their massive, fragile egos would never allow them to grovel at my feet. Furthermore, they knew I despised them. They knew I would laugh in their faces and happily watch them burn. They needed to execute a hostile corporate takeover without my consent. They needed a mechanism to bypass my legal ownership and seize the asset directly. That was the exact moment the seed of their most despicable plan took root. They decided that my past struggles with anxiety could be weaponized. They decided to label me as psychologically unfit to manage my own empire. They would build a fake medical case, strip away my human rights, and take my $50 million algorithm by absolute legal force. The countdown to my ultimate revenge had officially begun. The countdown to my ultimate revenge had officially begun. 2 days after Devin and Richard made their sickening discovery, my phone buzzed with an incoming text message. It was from my mother, Catherine. The message was dripping with fake maternal affection. She claimed the family had done a lot of soul-searching recently. She said they deeply regretted how distant we had become over the past decade. She begged me to come to the house on Sunday evening for a private family dinner. She called it a safe space for healing and reconciliation. I stared at the screen and let out a cold, hard laugh. They were not looking for healing. They were setting a trap. I knew exactly what they were planning, but I texted back that I would be there. I needed to walk directly into their ambush to maintain the illusion that I was still their naive and desperate daughter. When I arrived at their sprawling, heavily mortgaged estate that Sunday, the air inside the house felt thick and suffocating. The dining room table was completely empty. There was no dinner prepared. Instead, Catherine ushered me into the formal living room. Richard was sitting in a high-backed leather armchair, looking grave and deeply concerned. Caroline sat on the velvet sofa with her hands folded neatly in her lap, wearing a somber expression she probably practiced in the mirror. Devin stood near the fireplace, trying to project an aura of quiet, protective authority. The room was set up exactly like a judicial tribunal. I took a seat in the single chair positioned in the center of the room, intentionally isolating myself to play the role of the victim. Catherine sat down next to Caroline and let out a heavy theatrical sigh. She looked at me with eyes full of manufactured pity. Naomi, we asked you here because we love you, she began. Her voice was soft and sickeningly sweet. We have been watching you from afar for a very long time. We know you have been trying so hard to build a life for yourself, but we also know how deeply you have been struggling. I furrowed my brow, feigning total confusion. I asked her what she meant. Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He adopted the tone of a benevolent patriarch carrying a heavy burden. We are talking about your mental health, Naomi, he said gravely. We remember how completely you broke down in college. We saw the severe anxiety and the emotional instability that forced you to drop out. We know those demons never truly go away. I felt a surge of pure, absolute rage, but I kept my face entirely neutral. They were actively weaponizing the darkest period of my life against me. The anxiety I suffered in college was directly caused by their relentless psychological abuse. Now they were twisting that history to build a false narrative of chronic mental illness. I let my voice tremble slightly as I asked them why they were bringing up something that happened 10 years ago. Caroline spoke up next, using her brand new Harvard degree to sound authoritative. Because it is highly relevant to your current situation, Naomi, she said. Her tone was clinical and sharp. "We know about your technology company. We know you have been trying to run a financial software platform. We also know that the stress of managing something of that magnitude is completely destroying your mental state. You are not equipped to handle corporate pressure. You are acting erratically and making highly dangerous choices." I widened my eyes and let my hands shake visibly in my lap. I asked them how they knew about my company. Devin stepped forward from the fireplace, crossing his arms over his chest. "In the financial sector, people talk, Naomi." He lied smoothly. "When my analysts ran routine market evaluations, we saw the chaotic state of your business infrastructure. Your erratic decision-making is putting your entire platform at massive risk. You are a danger to yourself and your corporate clients. As a family, we cannot just sit back and watch you crash and burn." Catherine reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a thick, printed folder. She placed it on the coffee table, sliding it slowly toward me. "This is a comprehensive timeline of your unstable behavior," she declared softly. "It documents your sudden isolation from the family, your obsessive work habits, and your complete detachment from reality. We have been consulting with experts. They all agree that you are suffering from severe delusions of grandeur and acute paranoia. They were gaslighting me with terrifying precision. If I had not already known their true financial motives, this calculated psychological assault might have actually made me doubt my own sanity. They were attempting to systematically dismantle my grip on reality. They wanted to convince me that my success was a delusion and my independence was a symptom of a severe mental breakdown." Richard stood up and walked over to my chair, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. "We are not angry with you, Naomi," he said. "We just want to protect you from yourself. Running a multi-million-dollar technology company requires a stable, brilliant mind. You need to step down immediately and let your family take the reins before you destroy everything you have built. We are prepared to step in and manage your assets for you. We will take over the corporate responsibilities so you can finally get the intensive psychiatric help you so desperately need." The sheer audacity of his proposal was breathtaking. He was framing the hostile takeover of my $50 million company as an act of loving paternal sacrifice. Caroline nodded, adding that it was the only legally sound way to protect my wealth from my own incompetence. They were perfectly executing the first phase of their trap. I looked down at my hands, forcing a shallow breath. I whispered that I was so tired. I let the silence hang in the air after my whispered confession. My mother, Catherine, let out a breath of performative relief. She reached across the coffee table and placed her hand over mine. I forced myself not to pull away from her cold, icy touch. Richard stood up immediately. He did not waste a second comforting me. He walked straight to his mahogany desk and picked up his phone. He announced he had anticipated my willingness to accept help. He claimed he had arranged a preliminary medical consultation to get the process started. Less than 10 minutes later, the front doorbell rang. Caroline stood up to answer it. She returned with a tall man carrying a leather medical bag. The man introduced himself as Dr. Harrison. I recognized him instantly. He was not a random medical professional. He was my father's frequent golf partner at their exclusive country club. Dr. Harrison was a high society psychiatrist known for catering to wealthy families who needed discreet solutions to embarrassing problems. He had a reputation for writing favorable prescriptions and providing convenient legal diagnoses for the elite. Now he was being paid a massive sum of cash to act as the medical executioner for my independence. He sat back down directly opposite me and gave me a practiced, comforting smile. He told me he was there as a friend of the family to simply chat and assess my baseline stress levels. The evaluation was a complete farce. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Dr. Harrison did not ask me about my business metrics or daily routine. Instead, he asked highly leading questions designed to corner me into sounding unstable. He asked if my immense success felt overwhelming or entirely unreal to me. When I replied calmly that I worked hard for my achievements, he jotted down notes and shook his head sadly. He told me that severe delusions of grandeur often manifested as a fierce defense of imaginary accomplishments. He asked if I felt like people were constantly plotting against me. I looked directly at my parents and Devon sitting like vultures around the room. I replied that I was simply cautious about who I trusted. Dr. Harrison sighed heavily and closed his notepad. He looked at Richard and Catherine with a grave expression. He diagnosed me right there in the living room without running a single legitimate clinical test. He stated clearly that I was suffering from severe acute paranoia, combined with a dangerous manic episode. He claimed my perception of reality was entirely fractured by the stress of trying to run a company I was fundamentally unequipped to handle. He told my parents that leaving me in control of my own personal financial assets would be a catastrophic medical failure. He said I was a textbook case for an immediate medical conservatorship. He promised he would personally expedite the legal paperwork and testify before a judge that I required absolute supervision. Catherine buried her face in her hands, pretending to cry at the tragic news. Richard placed a comforting arm around her shoulders while exchanging a victorious glance with Devon. Caroline nodded solemnly, telling the good doctor they were prepared to do whatever it took to save my life. They were acting out a twisted tragedy, where they were the heroic saviors, stepping in to rescue their broken daughter. I sat perfectly still, quietly absorbing the sheer evil of their coordinated attack. They were completely willing to strip me of my basic human rights. They were willing to have me legally declared incompetent and trap me in a financial prison for the rest of my life, all to steal my algorithm and save their own pathetic facades. Dr. Harrison outlined the next steps of their hostile takeover. He explained that once the judge signed the emergency conservatorship order, my father would become my legal guardian. Richard would have absolute authority over my bank accounts, my medical decisions, and my corporate holdings. I would not be able to sign a contract, hire a lawyer, or buy a cup of coffee without his explicit written permission. My company would be legally transferred into a trust controlled entirely by my parents. They would have the immediate legal power to liquidate the business, sell my software platform, and distribute the funds however they saw fit. They were going to rob me completely blind, and the legal system was going to hold the door wide open for them. The terror of their plan was suffocating, but I did not let it break me. I knew I had one crucial advantage. They vastly underestimated me. They still saw me as the frightened 22-year-old girl they had cruelly kicked out onto the street. They thought their aggressive tactics and fake medical authority would terrify me into signing over power of attorney voluntarily to avoid a messy court battle. They wanted me to surrender quietly. They needed me to surrender quickly because their own massive debts were coming due. I kept my head bowed and let my shoulders slump. I whispered that I was terrified of losing my mind. I told them I did not want my private struggles dragged into the public record. Richard smiled triumphantly. He told me there was absolutely no need for a public spectacle. He promised that if I signed an interim power of attorney document that night, they could handle the transition quietly. They could keep my dignity intact while taking over the company operations. He motioned for Dr. Harrison and Catherine to step into the kitchen to discuss the medical paperwork, leaving me alone in the living room with Caroline and Devon. Caroline stood up slowly and smoothed her expensive designer dress. She told me she was going to go check on her mother, leaving the heavy lifting to her fiancé. She walked out of the room without a single ounce of empathy. That left me completely alone with the arrogant hedge fund fraud himself. Devon stood still, listening to Caroline's heels fade down the hallway. The mask dropped. He turned toward me, and his posture shifted from protective to utterly predatory. He walked over to the heavy oak doors and turned the brass lock. The sharp click echoed like a gunshot. He was physically trapping me inside to establish absolute dominance. He wanted me to feel the full, crushing weight of my isolation. He walked back to the center of the room and stood towering over my chair. He deliberately used his height and tailored presence to intimidate me. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded legal document. He tossed it onto the coffee table right next to the fake psychiatric evaluation. It was an interim power of attorney and an asset transfer agreement designed to immediately hand over complete executive control of my financial technology platform to his management firm. Devin looked down at me with cold, ruthless calculation. He adjusted his expensive watch, a watch I knew he had financed through a predatory lender, and let out a harsh, humorless laugh. He told me it was time to drop the pathetic victim act. He said we both knew I was in way over my head, and dragging this out would only result in complete public humiliation. He leaned down, resting his hands on the arms of my chair, caging me in. Black men have to work 10 times harder to achieve this level of elite status, Naomi, he said, his voice dripping with condescending authority. Do you have any idea what it took for me to build my empire? I had to outsmart every privileged kid on Wall Street. I had to be flawless. I have secured my legacy, and I will not let your mental stubbornness or erratic behavior tank my fund or destroy this family. The sheer audacity of his speech was breathtaking. He was using his race to justify stealing my life work. He was weaponizing his identity to gaslight me into surrendering my company. He told me that my algorithm was incredibly valuable, but currently being wasted in the hands of an unstable college dropout. He insisted he was the only one equipped to maximize its market potential. He painted himself as a financial savior stepping in to rescue a failing project. You are sick, Naomi, he whispered, leaning closer. You are deeply unwell and making catastrophic business decisions. If you force us to take this to a judge, Dr. Harrison will testify that you are a severe danger to yourself. The court will strip away your rights completely. You will be placed in a locked facility, and Richard will sell your company for parts. You will have nothing. But if you sign this transfer agreement right now, I will protect you. I will personally vouch for your recovery and make sure you retain a small monthly allowance. I stared at the legal document resting on the table. Inside my mind, I was violently dissecting his speech. I knew his hedge fund was completely wiped out. I knew he was days away from catastrophic default and federal indictments. He was sweating through his bespoke suit because his entire fake billionaire reality was collapsing. He was projecting his own financial desperation onto me. He was calling me a catastrophic failure while secretly drowning in aggressive margin calls. The irony was so potent I could almost taste it. But I could not let him see any of that. I needed to feed his massive, fragile ego. I needed to make him believe his intimidation tactics had broken my spirit entirely. I needed to play the role of the terrified, unstable daughter perfectly. I started to hyperventilate. I forced my breathing to become shallow and rapid. I let my hands shake violently in my lap. I squeezed my eyes shut and forced hot tears to spill down my cheeks. I let out a jagged, pathetic sob and curled my body inward, making myself look small and helpless. I brought my trembling hands to my face and began to rock back and forth. Please, I begged, my voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. Please, Devin, you are scaring me. I cannot breathe. My mind is spinning. Everything is moving too fast. I cannot make a decision tonight. I feel like I am losing my grip on reality. Devin stood straight, looking down at my theatrical breakdown with absolute disgust. He saw exactly what he wanted to see. He saw a weak, broken girl folding under the pressure of his immense authority. He saw an easy victory. He let out a heavy sigh, playing the part of the weary, merciful conqueror. He picked up the transfer document and tapped it against his palm. I continued to sob violently, begging him for a little more time. I told him I was terrified of going to court and ending up in a locked psychiatric ward. I promised him I understood he was only trying to help me. I swore that if he gave me a few days to accept the reality of my condition, I would sign the papers voluntarily. I told him I just needed a moment to say goodbye to the company I had built. Devin smiled a predatory grin. He patted my shaking shoulder condescendingly. He told me I had exactly 10 days to heal and get my mind right before the paperwork became absolutely mandatory. He warned me that if I tried to contact a lawyer, he would have the emergency conservatorship order executed within the hour. He truly thought he had won. He unlocked the study doors and walked out, leaving me sobbing in the chair. The moment the door clicked shut behind him, my tears stopped instantly. My hands went perfectly still. I wiped my face and smiled in the empty room. He had given me 10 days. I only needed a week to destroy him. I waited exactly 4 minutes before leaving my father's private study. When I emerged into the hallway, my posture was slumped, and my eyes were appropriately red. Richard and Catherine were waiting in the formal living room with Caroline. Devon was standing by the fireplace, nursing a glass of scotch, looking like a victorious general. I kept my head down and walked slowly toward my parents. I told them in a weak, trembling voice that I had thought about everything they said. I admitted that the pressure of running a financial technology company was completely destroying my mental stability. I told them I was desperately afraid of having another breakdown like the one in college. I asked them to give me just a few days of total isolation to begin my intensive therapy and mentally prepare myself for the corporate transition. I promised them I would return by the end of the week to sign the conservatorship paperwork and the asset transfer agreements. Catherine rushed forward and wrapped her arms around me in a suffocating theatrical hug. She stroked my hair and praised me for finally being brave enough to accept their help. Richard patted my back, assuring me that the family would handle all the heavy corporate lifting from now on. Caroline simply smiled a tight, triumphant smirk. They were so blinded by their own greed and arrogance that they bought my performance completely. They let me walk out the front door believing they had successfully conquered my empire. The second I stepped off their heavily mortgaged property, my entire demeanor shifted. I pulled out my phone and sent a secure, encrypted message to Wesley. The text was short and absolute. Initiate the final phase. I drove straight back to Brooklyn and threw away the tear-soaked tissues. I had a multi-million-dollar company to sell, and I was on a severely accelerated timeline. The following morning, I did not go to therapy. I put on my sharpest tailored suit, grabbed my encrypted laptop, and headed straight to a highly secure corporate office building in the heart of the financial district. Wesley was already waiting for me in the lobby. He handed me a fresh cup of black coffee and a thick dossier containing the final due diligence reports. We took the private elevator up to the top floor where the executive acquisition team from one of the most ruthless investment banks on Wall Street was waiting for us. These were not casual venture capitalists looking for a fun startup to mentor. These men and women were absolute sharks. They managed billions in institutional wealth, and they only cared about brutal, unyielding efficiency. They had been quietly circling my platform for months, running covert stress tests on my algorithms. They knew my risk assessment software was a revolutionary leap forward in predicting market volatility. They wanted exclusive ownership, and they had the cash to make it happen immediately. We entered the massive glass-walled conference room. 3 senior executives sat across the polished mahogany table. The lead negotiator was a sharp-eyed woman who did not waste a single second on pleasantries. She slid a binding acquisition contract across the table toward me. She stated their initial offer clearly and without emotion. $40 million for total ownership of the platform, the underlying intellectual property, and a 2-year non-compete clause. It was a massive sum of money, a life-changing amount of wealth that would have made any normal startup founder sign on the dotted line immediately. I did not touch the pen. I did not even look at the contract. I looked directly into the lead negotiator's eyes and slid the folder back across the polished table. I kept my voice completely level and stripped of all emotion. I told her that my team and I had independently audited their firm's current risk assessment protocols. I explicitly detailed the exact statistical flaws in their current trading software. I demonstrated how my proprietary algorithm would plug those massive holes and save their compliance department an estimated $200 million in the very first fiscal year. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the glass table. I told them $40 million was an insult for a technology that would secure their market dominance for the next decade. I demanded $50 million in a clean, untraceable cash buyout. I also required the entire financial transaction to be legally sealed and heavily protected by ironclad non-disclosure agreements until the funds fully cleared my private offshore accounts. I told them I needed the wire transfer completed and fully verified within exactly 96 hours. If they could not meet that aggressive timeline, I would take my algorithm directly to their biggest competitor by noon tomorrow. The room went completely silent. The three Wall Street executives stared at me, their expressions a mix of genuine shock and calculating respect. They had expected to bully a young tech founder into a quick, cheap acquisition. Instead, they were staring down a woman who had absolutely nothing left to lose and everything to gain. They looked at each other, then back at me. The lead negotiator did not even bother to consult her legal team. She pulled a gold pen from her jacket pocket, crossed out the 40 on the contract, and wrote a 50. She initialed the change and slid the contract back toward me. We had a deal, $50 million in pure liquid cash. Wesley immediately took control of the legal execution. Over the next 4 days, my team worked around the clock to facilitate the absolute transfer of my company's digital infrastructure. I sat in my apartment ignoring the fake check-in texts from my mother and the condescending emails from Devin. They thought I was sitting alone in a dark room crying and heavily medicating myself. They thought I was mourning the loss of my independence and preparing to surrender my life to their absolute control. They had absolutely no idea that I was currently finalizing the largest independent tech acquisition of the quarter. When Friday morning arrived, I sat at my kitchen table and watched my secure banking portal refresh. The loading icon spun for 3 agonizing seconds. Then the numbers populated on the screen. The $50 million wire transfer had officially cleared. The cash was completely secured in my private trust. I was now a highly liquid, wildly wealthy, independent entity. I closed my laptop and took a deep breath. The first phase of my counterattack was complete. Now that I possessed an overwhelming amount of liquid capital, I was fully equipped to execute the most destructive part of my master plan. I did not just want to walk away rich and completely untethered from my toxic family. I wanted absolute and unyielding destruction for the people who had tried to steal my entire future. I picked up my phone and called Wesley. I told my chief of staff it was time to go shopping for some very specific and highly toxic corporate debt. The true financial slaughter was finally about to begin. The $50 million resting securely in my offshore trust account was not just a number on a screen. It was pure, unadulterated power. It was the weapon I needed to completely obliterate the empire my father had built on lies and stolen credit. I did not want to merely walk away and leave Richard and Catherine to their desperate flailing. I wanted to actively orchestrate their downfall. I wanted to be the architect of their absolute ruin. I met Wesley at 7 in the morning on a Monday. We bypassed the sleek corporate offices and met in a private soundproof booth at a high-end members-only club in Lower Manhattan. The kind of place where old money quietly suffocated new money. Wesley spread a series of highly confidential financial dossiers across the table. These were the detailed debt portfolios of Richard luxury real estate development firm. Donovan, the private investigator, had mapped the battlefield perfectly. Now it was time to deploy the artillery. Richard Company was suffocating under a massive mountain of toxic mezzanine debt. He had borrowed millions from a consortium of aggressive private equity firms. These were not traditional banks that offered grace periods in negotiation. These were financial predators who specialized in distress investing. They lent money at extortionate interest rates to desperate developers, and when the developers inevitably defaulted, the private equity firms seized the underlying real estate assets. Richard owed these predators roughly $22 million. His next minimum interest payment of $1.5 million was due in exactly 11 days. He did not have it. His corporate accounts were bone dry. "We are going to buy it all," I told Wesley, my voice steady and cold. "Every single toxic note, every mortgage, every lien. I want total control over my father's financial existence." Wesley nodded, his expression purely professional. He opened his encrypted laptop. "We will use the primary holding company we established last month. It provides complete anonymity. Richard will have absolutely no idea who is purchasing his debt until we are ready to reveal it." The process of buying distressed corporate debt requires absolute precision and aggressive negotiation. You cannot simply call a private equity firm and offer to buy a failing loan. You have to convince them that taking a guaranteed cash payout now is vastly superior to the long, expensive legal battle of foreclosing on an insolvent developer. These firms knew Richard was circling the drain. They knew his assets were heavily leveraged and potentially worthless in a fire sale. They were highly motivated to offload the risk. Wesley initiated contact with the lead private equity group. He did not identify me. He represented himself as the senior acquisitions director for a foreign investment syndicate looking to expand into the Manhattan commercial real estate sector. The negotiations were brutal and fast. The private equity sharks demanded 80 cents on the dollar for Richard's toxic debt. Wesley countered with 40. They fought back and forth for 3 days, leveraging financial models and threat assessments. I sat in the room listening to the conference calls. I heard the private equity managers laughing at my father's desperation. They called him a walking corpse in a tailored suit. They detailed his frantic phone calls begging for extensions. They mocked his pathetic attempts to restructure loans he fundamentally could not afford. The man who had publicly humiliated me, who had called me too stupid to manage adult money, was being actively ridiculed by the very people who held his life in their hands. It was intensely satisfying. On the 4th day of negotiations, Wesley delivered the final ultimatum. He offered 55 cents on the dollar in clean, immediate, untraceable cash. The offer was valid for exactly 2 hours. If they rejected it, the syndicate would walk away and leave them to deal with the messy, expensive bankruptcy proceedings of a disgraced real estate developer. The private equity firm capitulated. They accepted the offer. The massive cash transfer was authorized and executed through my anonymous holding company. The legal documents were rapidly drafted, notarized, and electronically sealed. It took less than a week to completely execute the hostile takeover. By Friday afternoon, I officially owned every single major loan tied to my father's luxury real estate company. I held the commercial mortgages on his struggling development projects. I owned the heavily leveraged corporate loans that floated his payroll. Most importantly, I held the primary tertiary note on the $20 million Hamptons estate he was currently using as a prop to impress Devon. I looked at the stack of legal contracts resting on the table in front of me. I traced my finger over the signature lines. The feeling of absolute control was intoxicating. Richard had spent my entire life dictating my worth based on my financial utility. He had destroyed my credit score to buy himself a few more years of pretending to be a titan of industry. He thought he was untouchable. He thought he had outsmarted the system and secured his legacy by offering Caroline to Devon. He had no idea that his entire existence was now legally bound in a folder sitting in front of the daughter he had cruelly discarded. Wesley poured 2 glasses of expensive scotch. He slid one across the table to me. "We have successfully acquired the primary targets, Naomi," he said, raising his glass. "Richard is now your legal tenant. He operates solely at your discretion. If he misses the payment next week, we have the immediate legal authority to execute a total asset seizure and freeze all corporate activity." I took a slow, deliberate sip of the scotch. The burn in the back of my throat matched the fierce heat of my anticipation. Richard was handled, the trap was set, and the jaws were ready to snap shut, but my father was only half of the toxic equation. I set the glass down and looked at Wesley. The cold calculation in my eyes matched the ruthless environment of the private club. "Richard is secured," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "Now it is time to hunt the hedge fund manager. We are going to buy Devon. We are going to purchase every single chain that is currently dragging him underwater. I want to own the man my sister thinks is going to save her." Wesley smiled a sharp, predatory grin. He opened a new encrypted file on his laptop. The digital hunt for Devon massive cryptocurrency debt was officially authorized. The secondary phase of absolute financial destruction was ready to begin. The digital hunt for Devon and his massive cryptocurrency debt was officially authorized. The secondary phase of absolute financial destruction was ready to begin. Devon was a much more dangerous target than my father. Richard was a desperate fool bleeding cash in plain sight. Devon, on the other hand, was a calculated predator. He operated behind the sleek, polished facade of a high-frequency hedge fund manager. He used his status as an elite African American financier to intimidate people into never questioning his balance sheets. He constantly demanded respect and claimed his success was the result of overcoming systemic barriers. In reality, his success was an elaborate optical illusion built entirely on catastrophic lies and desperate secondary loans. My private investigator, Donovan, had already mapped out the exact location of Devon's toxic debt. When Devon lost 70% of his investors' capital on reckless digital currency bets, he panicked. To prevent a massive run on his fund and avoid immediate federal prison, he sought out a shadow banking firm called Apex Capital Solutions. Apex was a ruthless secondary tier lender that specialized in providing high-interest lifeline loans to failing Wall Street managers. They gave Devon enough cash to cover his quarterly distributions, effectively helping him run a sophisticated Ponzi scheme. In exchange, Apex held the absolute rights to liquidate his entire fund and seize all of his personal assets if he missed a single payment. I sat across from Wesley in the soundproof booth at the private club. I told him I did not just want to buy Devon's debt. I wanted to completely own the financial guillotine hanging over his neck. Wesley warned me that dealing with a firm like Apex Capital Solutions would be significantly more complicated than negotiating with my father's creditors. Apex was highly aggressive. They enjoyed squeezing desperate hedge fund managers for extortionate interest rates. They would not simply hand over a lucrative debt portfolio just because we offered them a quick cash buyout. I smiled and took another sip of my scotch. I told Wesley we were not going to ask nicely. We were going to apply the exact same brutal pressure they used on their own victims. My financial technology platform had granted me access to massive amounts of institutional market data. I instructed my analysts to run a quiet stress test on Apex Capital Solutions itself. The results were incredibly revealing. Apex was deeply overleveraged. They had issued too many high-risk loans to failing companies, and their own institutional backers were beginning to demand liquidity. They were quietly desperate for an immediate cash infusion. Wesley immediately reached out to the senior partners at Apex. He used our anonymous corporate holding company to request an emergency meeting. We did not go to their offices. We forced them to come to a neutral, secure boardroom in Midtown Manhattan. 3 arrogant Apex executives walked into the room wearing custom suits and completely unearned confidence. They assumed we were just another desperate Wall Street syndicate looking to borrow dirty money. Wesley did not offer them a seat. He remained standing at the head of the glass conference table. He slid a single thin folder toward the lead executive. Inside the folder was a comprehensive breakdown of Apex's current liquidity crisis. Wesley calmly explained that we knew exactly how much cash they needed to satisfy their own angry investors. He then placed a binding contract on top of the folder. We offered to purchase Devon's entire debt portfolio for 100 cents on the dollar. We were willing to pay the absolute maximum premium for his specific failing notes in pure, untraceable liquid cash. The catch was that they had to sign the transfer documents immediately. If they hesitated for even a single minute, Wesley promised we would leak their internal liquidity crisis to the major financial press. We would trigger a massive run on their own firm and bankrupt them before the weekend. The arrogance vanished from the executives' faces instantly. They stared at the contract and then looked at Wesley with a mixture of pure terror and professional respect. They were sharks, but they suddenly realized there was a much bigger apex predator in the room. They did not even attempt to negotiate. The lead executive picked up a pen and signed the debt transfer agreements with trembling hands. The massive cash wire was authorized immediately from my offshore trust. By the time I walked out of that Midtown boardroom, I was the undisputed master of Devon's entire financial existence. I legally held the aggressive promissory notes. I owned the immediate margin call triggers. I held the indisputable documentary evidence of his massive cryptocurrency fraud. If I wanted to, I could hand the entire file over to the Securities and Exchange Commission and watch federal agents drag Devon out of his luxury apartment in handcuffs. But federal prison was too good for him. Prison would allow him to play the victim. He would spin a narrative about being an unfairly targeted minority in a biased financial system. I refused to let him control the story. I needed him to face his absolute destruction in public, surrounded by the elite society he fought so dirty to impress. I opened my phone and scrolled through Devon's public social media profiles. He had just posted a new picture. He was standing inside a bespoke tailor shop getting fitted for his custom wedding tuxedo. He was smiling arrogantly into the mirror. The caption read that true generational wealth is built through relentless hard work and elite partnerships. The sheer hypocrisy made my stomach turn. He was actively plotting to steal my company and lock me in a psychiatric ward while preaching about hard work on the internet. I locked my screen and looked at Wesley. I told my chief of staff to begin drafting the final margin call notices and the total asset liquidation orders. I instructed him to tie the execution of those documents to the exact date and time of Caroline's graduation dinner. We were going to let Devon put on his expensive tuxedo. We were going to let him buy the diamond necklace and toast to his fake empire, and then we were going to drop the floor out from under him. The secondary trap was perfectly primed. The only thing left to do was wait for the dinner bell to ring. The secondary trap was perfectly primed. The only thing left to do was wait for the dinner bell to ring. But I needed one final physical piece to complete my absolute monopoly over my family. I needed the crown jewel of my father's fabricated legacy. I needed the $20 million Hamptons mansion. Richard had leveraged that specific property into absolute oblivion, using it as collateral for his most aggressive private equity loans. When I purchased his toxic debt portfolio, I became the sole holder of that tertiary mortgage. I knew his grace period for the minimum monthly payment had officially expired 48 hours ago. Because I owned the note, I had the unilateral authority to trigger an immediate default. I did not send him a polite warning letter. I did not offer a grace period or a chance to restructure the failing loan. I instructed Wesley to execute a brutal and immediate foreclosure protocol. We bypassed the standard lengthy court procedures by utilizing a highly aggressive commercial deed in lieu of foreclosure clause hidden deep within the original lending contract. Richard had signed that contract years ago, in a state of pure desperation, completely ignoring the lethal fine print. The clause stated that upon a catastrophic financial default, the primary lender could immediately seize the physical property deed to satisfy the outstanding debt. I sat in my secure Brooklyn office watching the digital paperwork process in real time. Wesley coordinated directly with a team of elite property attorneys. They filed the transfer documents with the county clerk. I watched the progress bar on my computer monitor fill with bright green light. A sharp chime echoed from my speakers. The transfer was officially authenticated and permanently recorded by the state. I clicked open the digital file and stared at the final legal document. The deed to the massive Hamptons estate was now registered exclusively under my private limited liability company. I officially owned the sprawling manicured lawns, the private beach access, and the 10-bedroom luxury house my parents used to host their pretentious summer parties. I owned the very roof over their heads. I printed the heavy deed on premium stock paper and placed it securely inside a thick black folder. This was the exact house Richard was planning to dramatically gift to Caroline at her graduation dinner. He was intending to hand her the keys to a kingdom he no longer legally owned. The sheer magnitude of his impending humiliation was almost too beautiful to comprehend. I was going to let him deliver his arrogant speech. I was going to let him soak up the loud applause from his elite friends. And then I was going to hand him the formal eviction notice. With the real estate deed firmly secured, I turned my complete attention to the exact timing of the execution. I did not want a messy, prolonged legal battle spanning several weeks. I wanted a synchronized financial decapitation. I instructed Wesley to build an automated legal distribution system. We tied the release of every single destructive document to a specific digital timer. At exactly 8:30 on the night of Caroline's graduation dinner, the secure system would automatically email the formal margin call notices directly to Devon's furious hedge fund investors. It would simultaneously fax the commercial foreclosure documents to Richard's remaining business partners. It would electronically freeze all of their active bank accounts and permanently lock their credit lines. I was building a digital guillotine and programming it to drop exactly during dessert. The level of precise coordination required to pull this off was staggering, but Wesley managed it flawlessly. He ensured that there would be absolutely no way for Devin or Richard to stop the massive hemorrhaging once the timer hit 0. They would be trapped in that private dining room, completely cut off from their lawyers and their crisis management teams, while their respective empires burned to ash in the real world. To ensure they remained completely oblivious to the approaching slaughter, I had to maintain my performance as the broken and defeated daughter. 2 days before the graduation dinner, my mother, Catherine, called me. Her voice dripped with fake maternal concern as she reminded me about the upscale event. She told me it would be a wonderful opportunity for me to finally surrender my corporate burdens to the family. She casually mentioned that Richard would have the conservatorship paperwork and the corporate transfer documents ready for me to sign in a private room right after the champagne toast. She promised that once I signed away my company, I could finally rest and begin my intensive psychiatric treatment. I forced my voice to sound weak and entirely compliant. I told her I was deeply exhausted and completely ready to let the family take control. I thanked her for saving me from my own severe mental instability. She let out a satisfied little sigh and told me to wear something simple so I would not embarrass them in front of Devin's wealthy partners. I hung up the phone and smiled a cold, ruthless smile. She had absolutely no idea she had just spoken to her new landlord. She thought she was leading a lamb to the slaughter, but she was actually inviting an apex predator into her dining room. On the exact evening of the graduation dinner, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror. I did not wear the cheap clothes my mother demanded. I wore a tailored black dress projecting unyielding authority. I checked my encrypted mobile phone. The automated execution timers were armed and ticking down. My $50 million cash reserve was fully secured inside my offshore trust account. The deed to the Hamptons mansion was resting perfectly flat inside Wesley's leather briefcase. The highly toxic corporate debt portfolios were legally bound and fully ready to detonate. I stepped into my waiting car. The final stage of absolute financial destruction was officially beginning right now on this very night. That was the mindset I carried walking into the restaurant tonight. Sitting at the dimly lit table inside Le Chandelier, I stared at the broken red wax seal on the envelope Wesley placed in front of me. The flashback of the last 6 months dissolved, bringing me back to the present. The private dining room was silent. The wealthy guests held their breath, watching this confrontation unfold. My father Richard stood at the head of the main table, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. He had just finished publicly disinheriting me and mocking my intelligence. Instead of crying, I calmly reached into the heavy envelope. I pulled out the crisp, watermarked document. It was the certified cashier check from the Wall Street acquisition. I held it up so the ambient light caught the security features. The bold black numbers printed across the center line were impossible to misinterpret. $50 million. It was pure liquid capital made out directly to me. I laid it flat on the pristine white tablecloth. Richard marched toward my corner table, his dress shoes striking the hardwood floor with aggressive thuds. He pointed a trembling finger at Wesley and then directed his absolute fury at me. "You have completely lost your mind, Naomi," my father hissed. His voice was low and threatening, designed to intimidate me. "I do not know what kind of pathetic fake prop you printed out, but you are not going to ruin Caroline's graduation dinner. Pack up and get out before I have security physically drag you into the street." I did not look away. I slowly stood up and smoothed the front of my tailored black dress. I looked Richard directly in the eyes, matching his aggressive posture with cold, unyielding authority. "I am not going anywhere, Richard," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "And this is not a prop. It is the initial cash buyout from the financial technology platform I built entirely from scratch. The same company you and Catherine were planning to steal through a fraudulent medical conservatorship." Catherine gasped loudly, covering her mouth with her hands. Caroline looked panicked, her eyes darting between me and Devin. Devin stared at the $50 million check resting on my table, calculating the sheer magnitude of what I had just revealed. He knew a real certified bank draft when he saw one. I reached into Wesley's open leather briefcase. I bypassed the real estate deed for now and pulled out a thick, heavy binder filled with forensic accounting reports. I walked deliberately toward the center of the room, commanding the attention of every elite guest in the restaurant. I dropped the heavy binder right onto the middle of the main dining table next to Caroline's empty champagne flute. Since you enjoy making grand public announcements about financial responsibility, Richard, I think we should share the full truth with your esteemed guests, I declared. I flipped open the binder, exposing highlighted bank statements, loan applications, and aggressive collection notices. 10 years ago, you kicked me out because I dropped out of college. You told everyone I was a failure. But what you did not tell them was that the very next day, you and Catherine stole my social security number. You committed identity theft against your own daughter. You used my clean credit history to take out massive high-interest personal loans because your luxury real estate company was bleeding cash and the banks had cut you off. That is an outrageous lie, Richard bellowed, his face twisting with panic. He lunged forward, attempting to grab the binder, but Wesley stepped effortlessly between us, blocking his path with broad shoulders and a calm, menacing stare. It is fully documented and verified by independent forensic accountants, I countered loudly. You ruined my credit score for an entire decade. You saddled me with millions of dollars in toxic debt. You defaulted on loans you took out in my name. What did you do with that stolen money? You used it to pay for Caroline's astronomically expensive Harvard tuition. You used my stolen identity to buy her designer clothes European vacations and the fake luxury lifestyle she needed to trap a hedge fund manager. Caroline stood up abruptly, knocking her chair backward. You are completely psychotic, Naomi, she screamed, her voice shrill and desperate. You are jealous because I am successful and you are nothing. Devin, tell them she is crazy. But Devin did not speak. He was staring at the forensic bank statements resting on the table. As a man moving money for a living, he instantly read the fraudulent financial trail. The evidence was absolutely undeniable. Catherine burst into theatrical tears, attempting to play the victim. How can you say these horrible things about us? She sobbed loudly, clinging to Richard's arm. We gave you everything. We only tried to protect you. We never took a single dime from you. I reached into the binder and pulled out a specific loan origination document, holding it up for the room to see. This is a promissory note for $200,000, I stated. It was signed 5 years ago using my name and my social security number. The funds were wired directly into a joint checking account controlled by Catherine. 3 days later, that exact same amount was used to pay the catering deposit for the extravagant country club gala you hosted to celebrate your anniversary. You funded your high society parties by stealing from your own child. The private dining room erupted in shocked whispers. The wealthy guests, Devin's elite partners, and the old money socialites stared at my parents in horror. In their ruthless world, financial fraud was the ultimate unforgivable sin. Richard was hyperventilating, realizing his pristine reputation was evaporating in real time. You have no right to do this, he hissed. I have every right, I replied, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. And your nightmare is only just beginning. I turned back to Wesley, who was standing stoically with the open briefcase. He handed me 2 separate manila folders. One was dark red. The other was a deep navy blue. I took them and walked around the dining table. The clinking of silverware and the quiet murmurs of the elite guests had completely stopped. The entire room was paralyzed, watching the destruction of a dynasty. I stopped directly between Richard and Devin. They were both glaring at me, but the underlying panic in their eyes was unmistakable. I tossed the red folder onto Richard's plate. I dropped the navy blue folder right down in front of Devin. You both think you are so incredibly smart, I said, my voice projecting clearly across the private dining room. You both thought you could run the ultimate con and walk away as the king of Wall Street. You thought you could use Caroline as the perfect little pawn to merge 2 massive financial empires. The only problem is that neither of your empires exists. Let us start with this great real estate titan, I announced, gesturing toward my father. Devin, You thought you were marrying into a family that possessed generational wealth. You thought Richard was a billionaire who could inject massive amounts of liquid capital into your failing hedge fund. You thought he was your ultimate savior. But Richard is completely broke. My father's face turned a horrifying shade of purple. "Shut your mouth, Naomi," he roared, attempting to stand up, but his legs seemed to give out beneath him and he fell back heavily into his chair. I opened the red folder in front of Richard and spun it around so Devon could read the summary page. "His company has not closed a successful commercial deal in 5 years," I continued. "He is running a desperate shell game. He is weeks away from total public bankruptcy. And that $20 million Hamptons mansion he just proudly gifted to Caroline. It has 3 separate liens against it. It is completely underwater. If you marry her, Devon, you are not marrying into a trust fund. You are marrying into a catastrophic mountain of toxic commercial debt." Devon stared at the financial printouts. His jaw dropped. The carefully constructed mask of the elite hedge fund manager shattered instantly. He looked at Richard with absolute disgust. "You are bankrupt." Devon spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You told me your portfolio was generating double-digit returns. You sat in my office and promised to anchor my next investment round. You lied to me, you pathetic old fraud." Richard slammed his fist on the table, causing the crystal glasses to rattle. "How dare you speak to me like that?" he yelled. "You are nothing but an arrogant kid playing with other people's money." I smiled coldly and tapped the navy blue folder resting in front of Devon. "Speaking of other people's money," I said smoothly, "it is time to talk about your brilliant future son-in-law, Richard. You were so eager to hand Caroline over to him because you thought his hedge fund could bail out your sinking real estate company. You thought his massive crypto profits could pay off your predatory lenders." Devon lunged forward, trying to snatch the folder away, but I was faster. I grabbed it and opened it, displaying the catastrophic margin calls for the entire room to see. "Devon's elite hedge fund is a complete mirage," I declared. "He lost 70% of his investors' capital on reckless digital currency bets last winter. His entire portfolio was wiped out. To cover the losses and hide the fraud from federal regulators, he started borrowing from aggressive secondary-tier lenders. He is currently drowning in margin calls. He is personally insolvent. His bespoke suits, his sports cars, his luxury watches are all entirely financed by high-risk debt." The silence in the room was deafening. The Wall Street executives at the neighboring tables began whispering furiously to one another. Devon's elite partners looked horrified, realizing their own professional reputations were now tied to a massive financial scandal. Richard stared at Devon, his eyes wide with horrified realization. "You do not have the capital," Richard stammered, his voice shaking. "You showed me the balance sheets. You said your fund was flush with cash." "The balance sheets were forged," Richard first explained calmly. "You are both running the exact same desperate con. You are 2 sinking ships who tied yourselves together hoping the other would keep you afloat. Neither of you realized the other was made of solid lead." The realization hit them simultaneously. The mutual scam was completely exposed. They had been trying to pickpocket each other, and now they were both caught empty-handed in front of the most powerful people in New York. The explosion was instantaneous. Devon shoved his chair backward, creating a loud screeching sound against the hardwood floor. He pointed a trembling index finger at Richard. "You set me up, you broke piece of trash!" Devon shouted, abandoning all pretense of elite sophistication. "You tried to use your daughter to trap me into absorbing your toxic real estate garbage. I should have known you were a fake." Richard jumped to his feet, his face contorted with pure rage. "You arrogant thief!" Richard screamed, pointing right back at Devon. "You came into my house pretending to be a billionaire. You tried to steal my daughter to cover up your federal crimes. You are going to prison." They were shouting over each other, hurling insults and assigning blame. The polished, civilized atmosphere of the Michelin star restaurant dissolved into a chaotic shouting match. Catherine was crying hysterically into her napkin, completely unable to stop the disaster. Caroline sat frozen in her chair, looking back and forth between the screaming men. Devon turned to Caroline, his eyes cold and furiously dark. "The wedding is completely off," he snapped ruthlessly. "I am not legally attaching myself to a family of broke fraudsters. Keep the fake diamond." It is just cheap cubic zirconia anyway. Caroline gasped, clutching the necklace as if the stones had suddenly turned to hot coals against her skin. She ripped the jewelry off and threw it directly at Devon. The fake diamonds clattered uselessly across the expensive china. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing hysterically. Her perfect Harvard graduation had morphed into the most spectacular public humiliation in Manhattan history. Richard was hyperventilating. His chest heaved beneath his tailored tuxedo. He turned his wild, panicked eyes toward me. This was my fault. I was the one who had shattered the illusion, exposing his absolute failure to the guests. "Security!" Richard screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. He waved his arms frantically toward the restaurant management, who were already hovering nervously near the heavy oak doors. "Get management in here right now. I demand that this woman be physically removed from the premises. She is trespassing. She is completely insane. Get her out of my sight." Two burly security guards in dark suits immediately stepped into the private dining room. The restaurant manager trailed closely behind them, looking incredibly distressed by the chaotic scene. Richard pointed a trembling finger directly at my face, commanding them to throw me out. "She has ruined a private corporate event," Richard yelled. "I want her arrested for trespassing. Do your jobs before I sue this entire establishment." The security guards moved toward me, their expressions grim and serious. But they never even made it within 10 feet of my table. Wesley stepped smoothly into their path. He did not raise his voice or show a single sign of intimidation. He simply reached into his breast pocket and produced a sleek black identification wallet. He flashed a platinum-tier corporate card that carried immense weight in the financial district, stopping the men completely cold. "I strongly advise you to step back," Wesley told the security guards, his tone absolutely frigid. "This woman is the chief executive officer of a $50 million financial technology platform. She is currently conducting official legal business regarding massive debt acquisitions. If you lay a single hand on her, I will personally ensure this restaurant faces a devastating corporate lawsuit for interfering with a federal debt collection process." The security guards froze instantly. They looked at the manager, who quickly signaled for them to stand down. Nobody wanted to accidentally assault a billionaire technology founder in plain sight today. The manager bowed his head slightly and backed away, leaving Richard completely defenseless. "You cannot do this," Richard hissed, his face slick with nervous sweat. "You are a dropout, Naomi. You are nothing. You think you can walk in here with some fake bank statements and destroy my family. I will ruin you. I will hire the best lawyers in New York and sue you until you are begging on the street." "You do not have the money to hire a cheap traffic lawyer, let alone a corporate litigator," I replied, crossing my arms. "You are completely bankrupt, Richard, now." "I still have my properties," Richard yelled, slamming his fist against the table. "I still have the Hamptons estate. I am still a multimillionaire on paper. I will liquidate the mansion tomorrow, and I will use every single dime to destroy your pathetic little startup." I smiled a cold, hollow smile. I looked at Wesley and nodded. It was time for the final execution. Wesley placed his leather briefcase on the dining table right next to the discarded fake diamond necklace. He popped the latches and pulled out the thick black folder we had prepared carefully earlier that very afternoon. "Actually," Richard Wesley said calmly, opening the folder, "you do not have the Hamptons estate. You do not have any properties at all." Wesley slid a heavy premium stock paper across the table. It stopped right in front of my father. "What is this garbage?" Richard demanded, refusing to touch the paper. "That is a commercial deed in lieu of foreclosure execution," Wesley explained, perfectly articulating every single devastating legal term. "When you took out your most aggressive private equity loans, you signed a contract containing a catastrophic default clause. You signed all those exact rights away many years ago. Because you missed your primary interest payment 48 hours ago, the lender had the unilateral authority to seize the physical property deed immediately," Wesley continued. Richard stared at the document. His eyes scanned the heavy black text. His breathing became shallow and rapid. "My holding company purchased all of your toxic debt last week," I announced, stepping forward. "I legally became your primary creditor, And exactly 1 hour ago, I triggered that default clause. I executed the foreclosure while you were busy drinking champagne and delivering your arrogant speeches. Read the name on the registered deed, Richard, right now. Richard leaned over the table. His hands shook violently as he traced the ink on the paper. The Hamptons estate was no longer registered to his luxury real estate firm. The property was officially registered to my private limited liability company. No. Richard whispered, his voice entirely hollow. No. This is impossible. You cannot take my house. It is my legacy. I did not take it. I corrected him sharply. You threw it away when you decided to run a corporate Ponzi scheme. I simply bought the debt you were too incompetent to pay. Catherine let out a loud sob. Where are we going to live? Catherine cried. We are your parents. You stopped being my parents the day you threw me out on the street, I replied. I reached into the black folder and pulled out one final piece of paper. It was a formal, legally binding eviction notice. I dropped it directly onto my father's dinner plate. Earlier tonight you said the Hamptons estate needed a brilliant mind to maintain it, I reminded him. You have exactly 24 hours to vacate my property. If you are still inside my house tomorrow, the sheriff will drag you out. You have exactly 24 hours to pack whatever personal belongings fit into your cars and vacate my property. I said, my voice slicing through the chaotic noise of the dining room. If you are still inside my house tomorrow morning, the county sheriff will physically drag you out, and I will have you arrested for trespassing. Richard stared at the eviction notice. His hands were trembling so violently he could not even pick up the paper. The realization that he had just been rendered completely homeless by the daughter he despised finally broke him. The arrogant facade collapsed entirely. He looked up at me, his eyes pleading, begging for a mercy he had never once shown me. Naomi, please, Richard whimpered, his voice cracking. You cannot do this to us. We are your parents. We gave you life. You gave me trauma, Richard, I replied, entirely unfazed by his pathetic tears. And then you tried to give me a fraudulent conservatorship. You tried to lock me in a psychiatric ward so you could steal my life work. You do not get to play the loving father card now that you are completely broke. Catherine threw herself across the table, grabbing my arm. Her manicured nails dug into my sleeve. Naomi, sweetheart, she cried, mascara running down her cheeks in thick black lines. We can fix this. We can go to therapy. We can be a real family. Just please do not take the house. It is all we have left. Please, Naomi, you have $50 million. You do not need the house. I looked down at her hands gripping my arm. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no sadness, no lingering desire for her approval. I gently but firmly detached her fingers from my dress. I do not need the house, Catherine. I agreed, stepping back from the table. But I need you to understand what it feels like to be thrown out into the street with absolutely nothing. I need you to feel the exact same terror and isolation you forced upon me when I was 22 years old. Caroline was still sobbing, clutching the fake diamond necklace Devin had thrown at her. Her perfect Harvard graduation had been entirely eclipsed by the exposure of her family's massive financial fraud. She looked at me, her face twisted with a mixture of hatred and profound despair. You ruined my life, Naomi Caroline screamed. You ruined my wedding and my graduation. You ruined your own life, Caroline, I replied calmly. You spent your entire existence treating everyone around you like garbage because you thought you were untouchable. You thought your elite degrees and your fake trust fund protected you from reality. You are going to have to learn how to survive the hard way now, just like I did. I turned to Wesley, who was packing the documents back into his leather briefcase. We are done here, I said. I looked at Richard, Catherine, Caroline, and Devin one final time. I want to be absolutely clear. I announced, my voice carrying absolute finality. Do not ever attempt to contact me again. Do not call my office. Do not show up at my apartment. If you try to communicate with me through any channel, I will consider it harassment, and I will instruct my legal team to file a permanent restraining order. We share DNA, but we are no longer a family. You are nothing to me but toxic strangers. I turned on my heel and walked toward the heavy oak doors of the private dining room. The wealthy guests, the elite Wall Street executives, the old money socialites, parted like the Red Sea, allowing me to pass. They stared at me with a mixture of shock and undeniable respect. I had just executed the most ruthless and precise financial decapitation they had ever witnessed. I walked out of Le Chandelier, leaving the screaming, crying, and mutual destruction behind me. The cool night air of Manhattan hit my face as I stepped out onto the sidewalk. The city lights glowed against the dark sky. A sleek black town car was waiting at the curb. The driver opened the door and I slid into the quiet, luxurious interior. Wesley sat down next to me, placing the briefcase securely on the seat. "It is a clean break," Naomi Wesley said, checking his encrypted phone. "The transfer protocols are fully locked. The debt portfolios are secured, and the $50 million is sitting safely in the trust. They have absolutely zero legal recourse." I leaned back against the leather headrest and closed my eyes. The adrenaline that had fueled me for the past 6 months slowly began to fade, leaving behind a profound sense of absolute peace. The crushing weight of their expectations, the suffocating pressure of their conditional love, and the agonizing desperation for their approval were completely gone. I had finally excised the cancer from my life. I opened my eyes and looked out the window, watching the city blur past. The truth is, blood does not make a family. Biology is just a random genetic lottery. True family is built on mutual respect, unwavering support, and unconditional love. True family celebrates your victories and catches you when you fall. They do not use your vulnerabilities as weapons, and they do not view your success as a threat. I had spent 33 years trying to force a square peg into a round hole, desperately hoping my parents would magically transform into the people I needed them to be. The moment I stopped waiting for their validation was the moment I finally became unstoppable. I built my own empire from the ashes of their rejection. I surrounded myself with a chosen family of brilliant, loyal people like Wesley, who valued my mind and protected my peace. I realized that my worth was never determined by their toxic evaluations. My worth was determined entirely by my own relentless ambition and my absolute refusal to surrender. If you are watching this right now, and you are trapped in a toxic family dynamic, I want you to listen carefully. You do not owe them your sanity. You do not owe them your financial future. You do not owe them your peace simply because you share a last name. Setting a strict boundary is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of profound self-preservation. You have the absolute right to walk away from anyone who diminishes your light. Do not wait for them to change. Do not wait for them to apologize. Build your own life. Protect your own peace. Focus entirely on your own growth, and let your massive, undeniable success be the only answer they ever receive. You are stronger than their manipulation, and you are more valuable than their conditional love. I am Naomi. I was the black sheep, the college dropout, the family disappointment. But tonight, I am a $50 million technology founder. Tonight, I own the deed to their fake kingdom, and tomorrow morning, I'm going to wake up in a life that is entirely, completely, and beautifully my own. The screen fades to black. We are deeply conditioned to believe that biological family is the ultimate arbiter of our value. When the people who are supposed to protect, support, and nurture us instead choose to diminish, manipulate, or abandon us, the natural instinct is to internalize that rejection as a personal flaw. The most profound lesson embedded in these experiences is recognizing a difficult truth. A toxic family's inability to value you is a reflection of their own brokenness, not a measure of your true potential. Hitting rock bottom at the hands of those closest to you, whether through financial sabotage, emotional abandonment during a crisis, or public humiliation, forces a critical reckoning. It brutally strips away the comforting illusions you may have held about your family dynamics. While initially devastating, this absolute betrayal serves as a powerful catalyst for growth. It leaves you with a stark, defining choice: continue shrinking yourself to fit their destructive narrative, or establish rigid boundaries and walk away to build your own empire. True independence begins the exact moment you stop seeking validation from a dry well. Genuine success, inner peace, and authentic chosen families are built in the empty space left behind when you finally stop accepting conditional love and start demanding respect. The ultimate triumph is never about seeking petty revenge or waiting for a dramatic apology that may never come. It is about thriving so completely and authentically that their opinions simply become irrelevant to your reality. You learn that your greatest strength wasn't lost in the betrayal, it was forged by it. Evaluate the relationships in your life today and dare to walk away from any table where your worth is constantly being negotiated.